I spent 10 days in a coma after a terrible fall down the stairs. When I finally opened my eyes in the hospital, the chair beside my bed was empty. My son was gone. All he left was a crumpled note on the nightstand. Dad, I sold the house. You're nothing but a burden. Figure it out yourself. Don't call me. I broke down feeling my whole world collapse. Then 3 slow knocks came at the door. A man in an expensive suit walked in and said, "Perhaps your son isn't very smart." I froze when I realized who he was. The first thing that reached me when I came back to consciousness was the smell. Sharp antiseptic cut through with something colder, industrial bleach, the variety that doesn't merely clean a surface so much as scour it of anything living or warm. It caught at the back of my throat before my mind had even placed where I was, before the simple fact that I was still breathing had registered at all. The ceiling stretched above me in white, not the soft kind, a hard fluorescent white that left nowhere to hide. 2 long bulbs ran overhead, throwing off that low, relentless hum that works its way into your skull if you let it linger. I made a point not to let it linger. Welcome to his hidden revenge. I'm glad you're here with me today. Before we go any further, I'd love to hear from you in the comments which person in this story are you already rooting for and why. Just a few words is enough. Now, a quick note, some details in this story have been shaped for the purposes of telling it well, and any resemblance to specific real individuals or events is purely coincidental. What matters is the truth underneath it. My body felt like it had been disassembled and reassembled by someone working without instructions. My chest ached with every breath. My left leg throbbed from hip to heel. When I tried to lift my right hand, something pulled at the skin on my wrist, an IV line secured with white medical tape that had already begun peeling at the corners. The machine beside me beeped in slow, indifferent rhythm, tracking the pulse of a man it had no opinion about. I turned my head to the left. There was a chair in the corner, one of those hard plastic visitor chairs, the kind with the metal legs that scrape against tile when you pull them out. It sat at just the right angle, just the right distance from the bed for someone to keep watch over the person lying in it. It was empty. Something tightened in my chest that had nothing to do with the IV or the aching ribs. I told myself not to read into it. Caleb was probably down the hall getting coffee, talking to a doctor, working through insurance paperwork. That was a Caleb thing to do, always on top of the details, always organized. I'd raised him that way. I'd been proud of that. But even as I constructed that story in my mind, another part of me, the older, quieter part, that had learned long ago not to want too much, already knew. The chair hadn't been warm in a very long time. I lay still and let the memories drift back the way they do. After something like this, not in a flood, but in fragments, the way broken glass gets swept into a pile a few pieces at a time. I remembered the staircase at my apartment building. I remembered reaching for the railing. I remembered the way it gave, not gradually, not the way something worn down by years of use gives way, but all at once as if it had been waiting for me to trust it. I remembered the first impact my head against the concrete edge of a step, and then a sound like static filling every corner of the world. And then nothing. 10 days, the nurse would later tell me. 10 days between that, nothing in this ceiling. I'd put in 30 years at a warehouse on the north side of Brunswick, loading and unloading freight in heat that could crack asphalt. I walked away from the job with 2 bad knees, a lower back that made its feelings known every morning, and $52,000 in a savings account that I'd never touched, held in reserve for something that truly warranted it. Real emergencies. I'd given Caleb everything else, not in any grand or dramatic fashion, not the way people speak of sacrifice like it's meant to be witnessed. I simply did what I believe fathers were supposed to do. I worked the overtime. I went without the things that weren't necessary. When Caleb got into college, I sold my car and bought a used one, and never explained to him where the money came from when it appeared. When he needed the deposit on his first apartment, it came out of a jar I kept tucked behind the canned goods. He never asked about the jar. I didn't need him to ask. I just needed him to be all right. So I lay there staring at that empty chair, still rebuilding the story. He's exhausted. He's been here every day and needed rest. He stepped out 5 minutes ago. He'll come through that door any moment. That's when I noticed the piece of paper on the bedside table, folded in half, sitting next to the plastic water pitcher. Not placed there with any care or intention, set down the way you set down something you're finished with. The paper was slightly crumpled, as if it had spent some time in a pocket before landing here. I recognized the handwriting before I even reached for it. Caleb had always pressed down too hard when he wrote something his third-grade teacher had once mentioned, something I'd forgotten entirely until this moment, when the memory surfaced with a sharpness that surprised me. I used to tease him about it when he was small. "You're not carving a monument, buddy. It's just a grocery list." My hand trembled as I reached across and picked it up. The IV tugged again. I barely felt it. I unfolded the paper slowly, the way you open something, when you already have a sense of what's waiting inside, but need your own eyes to confirm it before you'll believe it. My heart was knocking hard against my ribs. The machine beside me quickened its pace. 3 sentences. That was all. "Dad, I already sold the house. You're nothing but a burden. Figure it out yourself. Don't call me." I read it once, then again, then a third time, because the words kept sliding past my understanding, like water off glass, like my mind was refusing to let them settle. Nothing but a burden. 30 years. 2 jobs for a stretch of 6 years when things got tight. The car I sold, the jar behind the canned goods. His graduation, when I stood in that crowd in a collared shirt I'd pressed twice because I wanted to look right for him. And I actually thought that this was what it had all amounted to. That moment, that kid in the cap and gown who caught my eye from across the lawn and waved with a grin that creased his face the same way his mother's used to. Nothing but a burden. The sob that came out of me was not dignified. It wasn't the quiet grief of a man finding his footing. It was raw and ugly, and it moved through my whole body, and the machine beside me began beeping faster as if it were alarmed on my behalf. The door opened. "Mr. Marsh." A woman's voice, steady, professional, warm in the measured way of someone who spends their days walking into rooms like this one. She was middle-aged, dressed in blue scrubs, a name badge clipped to her chest that read, Greta RN. She took one look at me and didn't ask whether I was in pain the way they usually do. She simply crossed the room, lifted the box of tissues from the windowsill, and placed it on the bed beside my hand. "Is there someone I can call?" she asked. I looked at the paper still in my hand. Then I looked at the empty chair. "No," I said. My voice came out rougher than I expected, scraped hollow. "There's no one." Greta didn't push. She stood there a moment, with her hands loosely at her sides, and something in her expression shifted, not quite pity, but recognition, as if she'd heard those exact words before, and understood there was nothing useful to say in their wake. She left quietly. The door clicked shut. The room settled back into its hum and beep, and I was alone with a crumpled piece of paper, and 67 years of a life that felt in that moment like it had been built on sand. I stared at the ceiling. The fluorescent light buzzed. The machine beeped. And then, just as the silence turned into the kind that presses down on you, 3 knocks landed at the door. Not a nurse's knock, not hesitant, not hurried. 3 deliberate, unhurried knocks, made by someone who already knows they're going to enter. The door opened before I could say a word. He wasn't a doctor. I understood that the moment he stepped into the room, not because of the suit, though the suit alone would have set him apart in a place like this. It was the way he carried himself. Doctors move like they're working through a problem. This man moved like he'd already put it to rest. I placed him somewhere in his mid-60s, silver-haired, clean-shaven, with a jaw that had probably been called distinguished for 30 years and had earned the description. The suit was charcoal wool, the kind that runs more than most people's monthly rent, cut close at the shoulders and hanging without so much as a single crease despite clearly having been worn for some hours. His shoes were dark cap-toe leather, buffed to a quiet shine, not flashy, just precise. He carried a black leather briefcase in his left hand, holding it at his side, as though it weighed nothing. His eyes found me immediately dark brown, steady, unhurried. Something moved through them that I couldn't quite name. Not pity, not the careful neutrality of a professional paying a call. Something closer to relief, the look of a man who had been searching for a very long time and had just after all those years found what he was hoping to find, exactly where he'd hoped to find it. He drew the visitor's chair from the corner and positioned it beside the bed. He sat, set the briefcase on the floor, folded his hands in his lap, and looked at me, the way you look at someone you've been waiting on. "Mr. Marsh," he said. His voice was measured and low, carrying the unhurried authority of a man who had spent decades in rooms where words carried weight. "I'm sorry to intrude. I imagine this is not the morning you'd hoped for. I was still holding the paper. I didn't try to hide it. I don't know who you are," I said. "No, you wouldn't." He didn't seem troubled by that. "My name is Alden Forsyth. I'm an attorney and the chief administrator of a private estate based here in Savannah. He paused just a beat, just enough to let the next words carry their full weight. "I've been looking for you for a very long time, Mr. Marsh." I stared at him. "Looking for me?" "Yes, I'm a retired warehouse worker from Garden City," I said. My voice came out flat, scraped down to bone. "I don't have a will worth reading. I don't own property anymore, apparently." I looked down at the paper in my hand. "There's nothing to find." Alden Forsythe looked at the paper too. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, more like a quiet fury held very still. "Perhaps your son isn't very smart," he said. "Is he?" I blinked. The words were so calm, so matter-of-fact, delivered without flourish, the way you might note that it looked like rain. And yet they landed in the center of my chest, like a stone dropped into still water, sending rings outward in every direction. "You don't know my son," I said. No, Alden agreed. "But I know what he just did, and I know what he doesn't know." He held my gaze without flinching. "Those two things are about to become very important." I should have thrown him out. I should have pressed the call button and asked Greta to come back. Instead, I found myself watching his hands still folded neatly in his lap. No fidgeting, no tells. And I thought, this man has sat in hard conversations before. This man is not afraid of what he's about to say. "What do you want?" I asked. "To tell you the truth," Alden said. "All of it. It's going to take some time, and some of it is going to be difficult to hear." He paused. "But I think, Mr. Marsh, or rather, I think you deserve to hear it more than you deserve what's happened to you this morning." Something about the way he said it, not with drama, not performing sympathy, just stating it as a plain and obvious fact, made the back of my eyes burn in a way that had nothing to do with the fluorescent lights. "Before I say anything else," Alden continued, "I need to ask you something." His eyes dropped just briefly to my right wrist. "That bracelet you're wearing, the silver one." My hand moved before my brain caught up a reflex, pulling my wrist slightly toward my chest, the way you instinctively shield something when you sense it might be taken. I'd worn that bracelet for as long as I could remember. It had been on my wrist the day the staff at St. Benedict's Children's Home logged me in as a new intake. No one had ever told me where it came from. I'd never managed to find out. I'd stopped asking years ago. I never took it off. "What about it?" I said. Alden didn't reach for it. He simply looked at it the way you look at something you've been hunting across a great distance and have finally found close enough to touch. "I've seen that bracelet before," he said quietly. "In photographs, in documents, in a description written by a forensic archivist who spent 14 months trying to match a piece of silver jewelry to a family crest." My mouth had gone dry. "What family?" Alden reached down and opened the briefcase on the floor beside him. His movements were deliberate, not rushed, not dramatic, just precise. He drew out a photograph old enough that its edges had softened and the colors had shifted toward warm sepia, and he held it out between two fingers. I took it. It was a photograph of a little boy, maybe 4 or 5 years old, standing before a tall iron gate set into a stone wall. The gate stood open. Behind it, visible in the distance, rose a white 3-story house with black shutters and columns along the front, the kind of house that belonged to a certain kind of Brunswick family, the kind whose name you saw carved in stone on buildings downtown. The little boy was squinting into the sun. He was smiling, and on his right wrist, clearly visible and catching the light, was a silver bracelet. My hand started shaking so badly the photograph trembled. The bracelet in the photograph was identical to the one on my wrist. Not similar, not close. Identical. The same narrow gauge, the same small engraved crest on the face, the same slight irregularity on the left side, where the silver had been shaped by hand rather than machine. "That boy," I said. My voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. "Who is that boy?" Alden looked at me steadily. His expression was careful, not cruel, not pitying, just present the way a person is present when they understand that the next few words are going to rearrange someone's entire world. "That little boy," Alden said, "is you taken in the summer of 1960 in front of your family home." He let a beat of silence pass. "Your real name is not Henry Marsh." The machine beside me beeped. Out in the hallway, someone laughed at something, a quick, ordinary sound that felt like it was arriving from a different planet. "Then what is it?" I asked. Alden reached into the briefcase again. This time he withdrew a document, thick and official, bound with a dark ribbon. He set it on the bed beside my hand, without opening it. "Your name," he said, "is Leonard Wyndham, And the man standing beside you in that photograph, he pointed to a tall figure just visible at the edge of the frame, one hand resting on the little boy's shoulder. Is your father Edmund Wyndham? He paused. He spent the last 40 years of his life looking for you, and when he died, he left you everything he had. The room didn't spin, it didn't do anything dramatic, it just went very, very quiet, like the moment after a sound so enormous that the silence it leaves behind becomes its own kind of weight. I looked down at the document on the bed, at the bracelet on my wrist, at the photograph of a little boy squinting into the sun in front of a house that apparently had his name on it. And somewhere deep in my chest, beneath the grief and the exhaustion and the wreckage of that morning, something cracked open, something that had been sealed shut for 63 years and let in just the thinnest sliver of a feeling I hadn't felt in so long that it took me a full 10 seconds to recognize it. Hope. I don't know how long I stared at that photograph before I understood what I was actually looking at. At first, my brain did what brains do when they run up against something impossible. It went looking for the rational explanation. Old photo, similar bracelet. Coincidence. There were probably dozens of silver bracelets in Brunswick that resembled mine. Jewelry got copied. Designs got repeated. This didn't have to mean anything. Except it did. Because I knew this bracelet the way you know the back of your own hand. I'd worn it for 63 years. I knew its exact weight against my wrist. The way it sat slightly heavier on the outer edge, the small imperfection on the left side, where the silver curved just a fraction of a millimeter too tight. As if the craftsman had second-guessed himself, partway through. I knew the crest on the face, a small engraved design I'd spent years trying to identify, and never could, because wherever I'd come from, and whoever I'd been before St. Benedict's Children's Home took me in, that part of my life was simply gone. The bracelet in the photograph had the same imperfection. My hands were shaking so badly, I had to set the photograph down on the bed before I dropped it. That's my bracelet, I said. My voice came out like gravel. That's exactly my bracelet. Yes, Alden said. It is. But that's... I pressed my fingers to my mouth for a moment, trying to hold myself together. That boy can't be more than 5 years old. 4.5, Alden said. The photograph was taken in June of 1960 at the front gate of the family property in the historic district. Your father had just bought you a bicycle for your birthday 2 months early because he couldn't wait. Something moved across Alden's expression, something old and private and deeply felt. He was like that. He was never very good at waiting when it came to you. The words reached somewhere I wasn't prepared for, and my throat closed up so fast it startled me. I swallowed hard. You keep saying my father, I managed. I grew up in an orphanage. I don't have a father. You have one, Alden said firmly. Or rather, you had one. A very stubborn, very devoted, deeply impossible man who refused to accept what everyone around him kept telling him for 63 years. He leaned forward slightly. Mr. Marsh, what do you know about the name Wyndham? I shook my head. Nothing. Just a street name. There's an Ashford Avenue over in Pooler, Wyndham Capital Group, Alden said. Right in the heart of Brunswick, a 40-story tower on Meeting Street, all glass and steel, with the Wyndham crest worked into the lobby floor in black marble. Something nudged at the far edge of my memory. I'd gone past that building more times than I could count. Everybody in Brunswick knew Wyndham Capital. Old money, ancient money, the kind whose roots went deeper into this soil than the city charter itself. I ran my tongue over my lips. That's one of the most powerful private equity firms in the state. In the southeast, Alden said, correcting me without any trace of satisfaction, just the plain fact of it. Established in 1938 by a man named Edmund Wyndham, your grandfather on your father's side, then handed down to his son, your father also Edmund in 1970. He let that sit. Your name, your true name, is Leonard Edmund Wyndham. You are Edmund Wyndham, the thou's only child and the last living heir this family has. Something shifted in the room, like the floor had dropped a fraction of an inch. Not enough to send me falling, just enough to make the world feel tilted and wrong. That isn't possible, I said. My voice gave out somewhere in the middle of the sentence. I'm a man who worked a warehouse floor, 30 years behind a forklift. I lived in a 2-bedroom apartment where you could always smell what the neighbors had on the stove. I'm not anyone. Enough. Alden's voice didn't rise, but something hard lived beneath it. The kind of stillness that doesn't require your agreement. Don't do that to yourself. Don't let what was done to you through someone else's wickedness become the whole of who you are. His eyes didn't leave mine. You are not nobody. You have never been nobody. And the man who refused to stop searching for you across 63 years would have real anger to hear you speak that way. Something gave way inside my chest, like a green branch snapping under weight. He searched for me. Those words barely made it out of my throat. Every day without exception, Alden said. At the start, he brought in private investigators. When one team hit dead ends, he commissioned another. When every trail went cold and stayed that way, he kept those case files open on his desk and went on waiting. He reached into the briefcase and came out with a photograph, one I hadn't seen before. Crisp colors, a man somewhere in his late 70s behind a broad mahogany desk, silver hair back straight as a board, his face carrying the particular stillness of someone who has long since made his peace with a burden he can't put down. "This is your father," Alden said, "shot roughly 6 years before he died." I held it in both hands and studied it. The jaw, the line of the brow, the way his eyes creased at the outer corners. Not a smile, not quite, but not the absence of one either. "Oh God," I breathed. "You can see it," Alden said. I could. The way you suddenly catch yourself in a mirror, you forgot was there, that instant of blankness, and then the crash of recognition. The face in that photograph was my face. Older, more weathered, marked by decades of weight I'd never had to carry. But the underlying architecture was identical. The bones, the structure, all the same. "He's gone," I said. My voice fractured on that last word, and I had no way to mend it. 2 years back, Alden said, his tone soft. January 2022. His heart. He was 89 years old. Alden gave me space with that. He died under the roof he'd lived beneath his entire life. The same roof you came home to as a newborn. A noise left me before I knew it was coming. Not a sob exactly, something more like pressure that had built past the point of containing itself, finally finding a seam to escape through. My father had been dead 2 years, and for the 63 years before that, he had been alive. All those mornings I spent steering a forklift, packing a lunch pail, pressing a shirt for Caleb's graduation, my father had been breathing, living 70 miles away in the old part of that same city. "He never tracked me down," I said. "Not a question." "No," Alden said, and his voice held something that had the texture of old grief, the kind that gets so familiar it stops feeling like grief and just feels like you. "He never quit looking, but no, he didn't find you. Not while there was still time." He paused there. "That was the only place in his life your father ever called himself a failure. Everything he constructed, everything he accomplished, none of it weighed what you did to him." I pressed the heel of my palm hard against my eye socket, because if I let go, I was going to fall apart completely, and some rigid bone-deep piece of a 68-year-old man, with 3 decades of warehouse grime under his fingernails, wasn't ready to permit that. "You told me he left me everything," I said, hauling my voice back to level by sheer stubbornness. "What exactly does everything cover?" Alden drew from the briefcase one last item, a thick document notarized, cinched with a dark green ribbon. He placed it on the bed the way you'd set down something that had taken 50 years to arrive at this moment. "It means Wyndham Capital Group," he said. "The historic district property, the family seat, the investment portfolios, the trusts, every account." He kept his eyes on mine without wavering. "It means $950 million, Leonard, the entirety of it, every last cent. Yours alone, no one else's." That figure hit me like something with physical mass. $950 million. My gaze drifted to Caleb's note, still crumpled and half showing on the nightstand. "You're nothing but a burden." Alden held his silence a beat. He went back into the briefcase and retrieved a second photograph, sharper than the first, the colors vivid and unambiguous. He passed it across without commentary and let me look. This man was late 70s, possibly nudging 80, silver-haired, his spine straight, both hands resting folded on the surface of a wide mahogany desk. Time had cut lines into his face the way weather cuts into stone, not destroying it, reshaping it, giving it a kind of permanent gravity. The jaw was firm, the gaze was level, and that jaw, it was mine. "That's him," I said. No question mark anywhere in it. My voice had gone to somewhere just above nothing. "That's Edmund Wyndham, taken 6 years before he passed," Alden said. He had no patience for cameras, but I pushed that year. Something told me to. I sat there unable to pull my eyes from the image. 68 years old, flat on my back in a hospital bed, and I was seeing my father's face for the first time in my life. "Tell me who he was," I said. My throat ached with every breath as I worked to keep my voice from breaking. Please, give me all of it. Alden shifted in his chair, and his whole bearing changed with the movement. The crisp professional posture loosened just a degree or two into something older and more personal. Edmund Wyndham was not a comfortable man to be around, he said. Demanding, precise. He had no tolerance for carelessness with things that mattered, but the love he had, he gave in exactly the same measure he gave everything else completely, with no half measures and no back door. Alden paused. Your mother, Elspeth, was a schoolteacher out of Beaufort. He asked her to marry him 3 weeks from the day they met. His own father thought the man had lost his mind. Even through the sting behind my eyes, something small and warm moved in my chest. 3 weeks. He could never see the point of hesitating, once you already knew, Alden said. His expression eased just slightly. You came into the world in September of 1956. The delivery was hard on your mother, and the doctors told Edmund afterward that there would be no more children. He described those hours to me, once said he'd never been so afraid in his life, before or since, and that when it was finally over and you and she were safe, something inside him went quiet and stayed that way, like a needle settling onto true north. His voice dropped. You were his whole world, everything full stop. My chest cracked open so quietly I nearly missed the moment it happened. She was gone by the time I was 2, I said. My mother. Yes, whatever took her moved fast. He was devastated, but he still had you, so he carried on. Alden's gaze held mine steady. He brought you up on his own, read to you every single night, took you to every baseball game that summer of 1960, the late weeknight ones too. Even when a 7 a.m. board meeting was waiting for him the next morning, you'd be asleep before the car reached the driveway, and he'd lift you out and carry you up to your room rather than disturb you. He paused. He came back to that story more than once when we spoke. A tear found its way down my cheek before I could do anything about it. I left it where it was. And then, August of 1961, I said, my voice dropping low. Alden's face went tight. Her name was Vera Holt. 11 years she'd been with the household, your nanny from the very beginning. Your father's trust in her was absolute and unexamined. His jaw hardened. One afternoon while he sat in a board meeting across town, she walked you out of that house. She told the rest of the staff she was taking you to the park. You didn't come back. I pressed my palm flat to my chest, trying to keep something in place that had started to come unmoored. He rang the police within the hour, Alden went on. They mounted a serious investigation. The Wyndham name meant something in Brunswick, but Vera had planned carefully. Cash only a forwarding address that turned out to be a vacant lot. The trail dried up within 3 days. He let a moment of silence settle. Everyone around your father urged him to accept what had in all likelihood already happened. His lawyers counseled him to begin planning for estate succession. His friends told him that grief had to find a resolution before it could heal. Alden held my gaze steadily. He told them all in language I will not repeat inside a hospital room, precisely where they could put that advice. A sound broke out of me, half laugh, half something rawer than that, and I pressed my knuckles hard against my mouth. He kept your room, Alden said. Exactly as it was the morning you vanished. Your books still on the shelf, a drawing you'd made of the two of you still taped to the wall above your desk. The leather softball mitt you just learned to hold that summer. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had fallen low. Every single week for 63 years, I walked into that room and set a fresh flower on your desk. Magnolias mostly, they grew in the garden, and they were your father's favorite. Your father's instructions were clear and simple. Keep the room ready. He was coming home. My shoulders shook. I made no attempt to stop them. Every Monday for 63 years, Alden said quietly. Without a single exception, I fell apart. Not loudly, not with any drama, just completely. The tears came fast and hot, and I let them go because there was nothing left in me that wanted to hold them back. 276 Mondays. 276 times. Alden had walked into that room and placed a flower on the desk of a boy who didn't even know his own name. Alden gave me the time I needed. He didn't glance away, didn't shift in his seat, didn't reach for the call button. He sat there with the patience of a man who had understood long ago that certain moments cannot and should not be rushed. When I finally gathered myself back together, I wiped my face with the backs of both hands and looked at Alden with everything I had left. He never remarried, I said. Did he? No. Alden said simply. He had his work, He had his search for you, and he held a conviction that everyone around him considered irrational, that you were alive somewhere, and that one day he would find you. He met my eyes with the steady assurance of a man who had watched that belief prove itself true. I joined the Wyndham household in 1977. I became his chief legal counsel in 1988. And in all the years I served him, I never once heard him say he had given up. I looked down at the bracelet on my wrist, the same bracelet on the wrist of the small boy in the first photograph, the very one Edmund Wyndham had fastened there before the world went wrong. "How did you find me?" I asked. "After all this time, how did you actually manage it?" Alden's expression shifted into something more careful, more measured. "It begins with a letter," he said, "delivered to the estate in the spring of 2007. No return address, written by someone who had spent 46 years carrying a secret that had grown too heavy to take to the grave." My breath caught. "Who?" Alden looked at me without blinking. "Vera Holt," he said, "written from a hospice bed in Brunswick 3 weeks before she died." "Vera Holt," I repeated. The name felt strange on my tongue, like something that had been sitting in the dark a very long time and had finally been dragged into the light. The woman who had removed me from my father's house when I was 4 years old. The woman whose face I couldn't picture, whose voice I couldn't recall, who had left me at St. Benedict's Children's Home, like a parcel with the wrong address, and walked away without looking back. "She wrote to you," I said in the spring of 2007. Alden confirmed. No return address on the envelope, but the postmark was Brunswick. The letter was 2 pages handwritten, and it opened with the words, "I don't expect forgiveness. I only want to tell the truth before I can't anymore." My jaw tightened. What did she say? She confessed everything. Alden's voice remained measured, but something cold moved beneath it. "She admitted to taking you from the house. She gave the name of the children's home in Garden City, Savannah, St. Benedict's, and the false name she'd registered you under. Henry Marsh." He paused. "She said she had thought about writing that letter for 40 years. She said she had talked herself out of it every single time because she was afraid of what it might bring down on her. But she was dying, and dying apparently has a way of recalibrating a person's priorities. Did she say why I pressed my voice coming out harder than I'd meant it to? Why she did it in the first place?" Alden nodded slowly. "Money. A man had paid her someone with a financial interest in destabilizing the Wyndham estate while Edmund had no heir. We were never able to conclusively identify who. Vera didn't know his real name, only a cash payment and a phone number that had been disconnected for 30 years by the time I went looking. He held my gaze. "She said she'd spent every year since trying to persuade herself it had been the right call, that you were better off, that you'd been placed with a decent family." His expression hardened a fraction. She clearly hadn't checked. The bitterness in my chest flared hot and sudden, and I pressed my back teeth together until it passed. "So you had the letter," I said, "but you still couldn't find me." "The letter gave me a place to start," Alden said. "St. Benedict's Children's Home, Garden City, Savannah, sometime in August of 1961. A boy registered as Henry Marsh." He exhaled slowly. "But St. Benedict's closed in 1980. Their records intake files, placement documents, all of it had been destroyed in a fire in 1977, 3 years before the closure." He spread his hands slightly. "There was nothing left on paper. Then how I spent 8 years tracking down former staff members," Alden said, "people who had worked at St. Benedict's between 1961 and 1977. Most had scattered, several had passed on. A few remembered very little children came and went. And after 50 years, the individual faces blurred into one another." He leaned forward slightly, and something shifted in his expression. The focused look of a man describing the single thread that it held. "In 2015, I found a woman named Bet Drummond. She was 89 years old, living in a care facility outside of Macon. She had worked as a junior intake coordinator at St. Benedict's from 1959 to 1970. My breath slowed. She remembered a child being brought in during the summer of 1961. Alden continued, "Not the face she was honest about that, but she remembered something that had struck her as unusual. The woman who brought the child in, described as nervous, middle-aged, well-dressed, had been insistent about one particular thing." He looked at me steadily. She said, "Don't take the bracelet off him. Whatever else happens, leave the bracelet on." The air left my lungs. Bet had remembered it because it was strange. Alden said, "Children arrived with almost nothing. A piece of silver jewelry was notable, and the instruction to leave it on that stayed with her." He glanced at my wrist. Once I had that detail, the search narrowed considerably. A man in his late 50s or early 60s raised in or around Garden City, Savannah, with a silver bracelet bearing an unusual crest. He paused. It still took 3 more years, but in February of this year, your name appeared in the Memorial Health University Medical Center, System Emergency Admission, Head Trauma, next of kin, listed as Caleb Marsh. He looked at me without blinking. I drove to the hospital that same night. I saw the bracelet through the glass of the ICU window, and I sat in the parking lot and waited for you to wake up. I exhaled long and unsteady, like a man who'd been holding his breath for 3 years without realizing it. She couldn't even take it off me, I said, my voice rough. Vera, she took everything else, and she couldn't take the bracelet. No, Alden said, she couldn't. He held my gaze. And that is why you were sitting here today. I pressed my fingers against my eyes for a moment, steadying myself. When I lowered my hand, Alden was watching me with the careful attention of someone who knew that the next part of what he had to say was going to land differently than everything that had come before it. There's something else, he said. His voice shifted, the warmth of the previous hour pulling back, replaced by something more deliberate. Something about Caleb that I haven't told you yet. He reached for his briefcase and rested it on his knee, both hands on the clasp. And I need you to be ready, Leonard, because what I'm about to show you is not the story of a son who panicked. It's the story of something that was planned. My stomach dropped. Show me, I said. Alden opened the briefcase with the unhurried precision of a man who had done difficult things for a long time and had learned that moving faster never made any of it easier. He withdrew a manila folder, thick with documents, and set it on the bedside table between us. On the cover, in neat black ink, 2 words had been written: Caleb Marsh. Let's start with the money, he said. He opened the folder and pushed a bank statement across the table, a printout with rows highlighted in yellow, the transactions ordered by date. I knew that account number the instant I saw it. It was mine. The savings I'd built across 20 years of double shifts and careful living, $52,000 in a savings account that I'd never touched because I was always holding it for something that genuinely mattered. Your account shows a 0 balance as of March 19th, Alden said 10 days ago, while you were in the ICU. The withdrawals were made in 7 separate transactions over 5 days, small enough each time to stay below the bank's automatic fraud threshold, large enough that the account was drained within the week. My jaw clenched so hard, my back teeth ached. Caleb, the withdrawals were made from ATMs and in-branch transactions at 3 different locations across Brunswick-Alden, said, tracing each highlighted line in sequence, all within a 15-mile radius of Caleb's home address. He looked up. I had a forensic accountant go through the records. There is no other reasonable interpretation. He took $52,000, I said flatly while I was in a coma. Yes. Alden held my gaze without flinching. With every breath, something burned at the back of my throat. Not tears this time, something drier, harder. Alden slid the second document across. A real estate transaction record stamped and notarized, dated March 18th, 1 day before the final bank withdrawal. Property address: my apartment building on Habersham Street, Garden City. Sale price: $155,000, $70,000 below current market value. Seller: Henry Marsh, represented by Caleb Marsh, under power of attorney. I stared at the words. Power of attorney, I said slowly. That means Caleb had legal authority to sell my home on my behalf. It means he claimed to Alden, said, his voice sharpening. A power of attorney is a legal instrument granting one person authority to act on another's behalf, signing contracts, managing finances, making legal decisions. It requires the signature of the person conferring that authority, witnessed and notarized. He reached into the folder again and drew out a separate sheet. The POA document itself, my supposed signature at the bottom. Next to it, a second sheet, a forensic handwriting analysis report, 3 pages long, concluding with a finding of 94% certainty that the signature was forged. He forged it, I said. He forged it, Alden confirmed. Fabricated the document, located a notary, we're still investigating how, and used it to sell your home while you lay unconscious in this building. He paused. Forging a power of attorney in Georgia is a felony. It carries up to 5 years in prison. The room felt like it had contracted since we'd begun. And the buyer, I said, my eyes falling back to the transaction record, Sienna Marsh. I looked up. His wife, your daughter-in-law, Alden said. Caleb and Sienna Marsh have been married for 4 years. They live in Isle of Hope. He let a beat settle. He sold your home to his own wife. Using your money as the down payment, the withdrawals from your savings funded the purchase. In effect, he used your $52,000 to acquire your $155,000 home, transferred it into Sienna's name at a loss, and left you with nothing. Alden's voice was steady. The look behind his eyes was not. The net result is that you woke from a coma with no home, no savings, and nowhere to go. I pressed my fist against my mouth. My eyes burned hot and fierce, and for a moment the anger was so sharp it crowded out everything else. "She's not just the wife," I said. "Is she?" Alden reached for the next document without hesitation. A printed series of text messages recovered through a legal preservation order on Caleb's phone records, each exchange dated and time-stamped. Sienna Marsh is a title examiner. Alden said she has working knowledge of property law, estate planning, and financial documentation. He pointed to the first exchange dated 8 months earlier, November of last year. This is where the conversation begins. I leaned forward and read, "Sienna, you need to look more carefully at your father's finances. Old men who work that long always have something tucked away. Caleb, he's got some savings. Nothing major. Sienna, it's not about the amount. It's about what you're entitled to when he's gone. You've been supporting him for years. Caleb, I haven't really. Sienna, you've been emotionally responsible for him. That counts. Start paying attention." I read the next exchange, then the next, each one nudging a little further down the same road. Sienna steering Caleb following the language, shifting in gradual degrees from vague resentment toward concrete planning. By January of this year, they were discussing the apartment's market value. By February, Caleb was asking Sienna how power of attorney documents worked. My hands were trembling so badly the paper rattled against my fingers. "She drove this," I said, my voice rough and low. "From the very beginning, she drove this. She provided the direction," Alden said carefully. "Caleb made the choices. But yes, the architecture of what was done to you financially was built on a foundation that Sienna Marsh laid brick by brick over the course of 8 months." He looked at me steadily. "She is not a passive participant." I set the papers down before I could crumple them. "Is that everything?" I asked. My voice had gone very quiet, the kind of quiet that holds nothing peaceful in it. Alden reached into the briefcase one final time. He set a USB drive on the table between us, small, black, ordinary looking. "No," he said, "it isn't." Alden picked up the drive, crossed to the small desk beneath the window, and opened his laptop with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything else. The afternoon light had shifted while we'd been talking longer. Shadows now, the sun dropping behind the line of buildings outside, settling into that particular late afternoon quiet that hospitals take on once the busiest part of the day has passed. He plugged in the drive. He didn't speak yet. He simply turned the screen toward me and pulled his chair around so we were both facing it. "Before I show you this," he said, "I need to give you some context. When I established that Caleb Marsh was employed at Wyndham Capital Group, which happened roughly 4 months ago, while I was still narrowing my search for you, I engaged a private investigator to monitor his activities. Standard practice in a state matters involving unknown heirs and potential complications." He paused. "The PI flagged something in late February. Caleb had visited your apartment building on 2 separate occasions within the same week outside his normal pattern. The second visit was captured on the building's exterior security camera, one that covers the main stairwell entrance." My mouth went dry. Alden clicked the first file. The footage was grainy but workable. The kind of quality a mid-range security system produces. Good enough to make out faces, good enough to read body language. The timestamp in the corner read March 10th, 2024, 7:14 p.m. The angle covered the second-floor landing of my apartment building's interior stairwell, looking down at the first flight of stairs from above. Caleb walked into frame from the left. He was wearing a navy windbreaker, dark pants, a baseball cap pulled low. A small backpack hung from one shoulder. He moved quickly at first, the walk of a man who knew exactly where he was going and had no interest in being seen. He reached the second-floor landing, glanced up toward the camera without appearing to register it, then crouched beside the stairwell railing. "That railing," Alden said quietly, "runs along the right side of the first-floor staircase. It's the one you use every time you climb those stairs." I watched my son unzip the front pocket of his backpack and pull out a small tool, a screwdriver. He worked quickly, efficiently, not the fumbling movements of someone improvising, but the practiced motions of a man who had worked out every detail before he arrived. He applied the screwdriver to the base bracket of the railing, where the upright posts met the concrete wall. He didn't remove the screws entirely. He'd loosened them just enough that the bracket shifted when he tested it with his palm, enough that the railing had appeared completely normal to anyone passing by, but would give way under any real downward pressure. He stood. He checked his work once more with a casual testing push, gave a slight nod to himself, zipped the backpack, and walked out of frame. The whole thing took 4 minutes and 23 seconds. My hands were gripping the bed rail so hard my knuckles had gone white. I didn't realize it until the metal edge started cutting into my palm. He knew, I said. My voice came out scraped hollow, like something had been dragged through it. He knew about the vertigo. You'd mentioned it to him multiple times, Alden said. You'd asked him twice in the previous month to help you tighten that railing, because you'd noticed it was getting unstable. He told you he'd get around to it. Alden's voice was flat and very controlled. He didn't get around to it. He made it worse. The rage that swept through me was so absolute it stopped feeling like rage at all. It felt structural, tectonic, like the earth giving way beneath a foundation, silent and total and beyond stopping. Show me the rest, I said. Alden clicked the second file. Same stairwell, different timestamp. March 13th, 2024, 6:47 p.m. 3 days after the first footage, I watched myself walk into frame. It was strange, profoundly, unsettlingly strange, to see your own body moving through a space 3 days before your life changed beyond recovery. I looked older on camera than I imagined myself to be. I moved with the careful deliberateness I'd spent years developing to manage the vertigo. One hand trailing the wall weight drawn slightly inward. No hurry. I reached the foot of the staircase and extended my right hand toward the railing. Alden stopped the video right there. I won't make you watch what happens next. He said you were there for it. I was grateful for that. I remembered enough. The railing pulling away in my grip. Not slowly, not with any forewarning, just gone in an instant. The support I had put my full weight on, dissolving in the very moment I'd committed to it. The world tipping sideways, the concrete edge of the step, catching the side of my skull, with the sound I experienced from the inside out. 10 days of nothing after that. What's the legal designation? I asked. My voice was steadier than everything beneath it. For what he did. What do they call it? In Georgia, intentionally creating dangerous conditions with knowledge of a specific victim's vulnerability and with documented financial motive can be charged as reckless endangerment causing great bodily harm, Alden said. Depending on what the full evidence picture looks like by the time a prosecutor reviews it, it could reach as far as attempted murder. He held my gaze. The video combined with what I'll show you next makes the attempted murder argument significantly stronger. Something inside my chest locked up so hard it landed like a physical blow. There's more, I said. There's more. Alden confirmed. He reached into the briefcase and withdrew a thick manila envelope, a corporate logo embossed in the corner, the name of a national insurance company printed in dark blue ink. He set it between us. Caleb applied for a life insurance policy. He said the insured party was me. The beneficiary was himself. He paused, letting that settle. He applied for it on February 25th, 16 days before he loosened that railing. The breath left me in a slow, measured exhale I held onto as long as I could, because what waited on the other side of it was something I wasn't prepared to let into the room. How much? I asked. Alden opened the envelope and placed the policy document face up on the bed. $750,000. The number sat there on the page like a verdict. $750,000. Caleb had decided that was what my life was worth and had worked through the administrative process of formalizing that figure 16 days before he made certain the railing would give way. He needed my signature, I said. My voice had gone very quiet. To take out a policy on my life, the insured party has to sign the application. I never signed anything like this. No, Alden said. You didn't. He reached into the folder and produced a second document, the signature page of the insurance application. A clean line at the bottom, above the words, signature of insured. This is what was submitted to the insurance company as your signature. He placed it beside a third sheet. A forensic analysis report from a handwriting expert, 4 pages dense with technical language and comparison diagrams, concluding on the final page with A finding stated in plain terms, the signature on the insurance application did not match authenticated samples of Henry Marsh's handwriting. Confidence level 96.8%. Insurance fraud, I said. First-degree insurance fraud in Georgia carries up to 10 years, Alden said. Combined with the forged power of attorney from last week, Caleb is looking at multiple felony charges before we've even addressed the staircase. He paused. But I want you to understand something, Leonard. Individually, each of these things is serious. Together they form a pattern, and patterns are what prosecutors use to establish intent. I looked at the signature that wasn't mine. Someone had sat down and studied my handwriting, learned how. I shaped my letters, reproduced it carefully enough to pass a non-expert's eye. The cold deliberateness of it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He sat somewhere and practiced forging my name, I said. Or Sienna did, Alden said. He reached for the final section of the folder, a printed sequence of text messages longer than the ones he'd shown me in the previous hour, covering a period from November of last year through early March. He laid them out in sequence across 3 pages and pointed to where I should begin. I read through the earlier messages I'd already seen Sienna steering Caleb toward his father's finances, a slow architecture of resentment being shaped into something more purposeful. But these ran further than where Alden had stopped before. Sienna, January 14th. The life insurance is the cleanest option. If something happens to him naturally, you collect. No questions. Caleb, he's not that old. He could live another 20 years. Sienna, he won't if his health keeps declining. You said the vertigo is getting worse. A wave of nausea hit me so fast, I had to press my palm flat against my sternum. Caleb, February 3rd. The railing on his staircase is loose. Has been for months. I keep meaning to fix it. Sienna, don't. 2 words, that was all. Don't. And then 4 days later, Sienna, get the policy done, this week, before anything changes. Caleb, you think this is actually going to work, Sienna? He uses that railing every single time he goes upstairs. You told me that yourself. Just make sure it stays the way it is. My vision blurred, not from tears from the sheer nauseating clarity of what I was reading. This was not a moment of weakness. It was not panic or desperation or some terrible decision made in the grip of a crisis. This was a conversation, a plan. Something that had been discussed over dinner and in bed at night, typed out on phones while the television murmured in the background, normalized into something as routine as scheduling an appointment. They had planned my death the way ordinary people plan a trip. She told him not to fix the railing, I said. My voice had dropped to something I barely recognized as my own. She knew exactly what leaving it loose would do to me, and she told him to leave it. Yes, Alden said. And the insurance policy was her idea. The text record suggests it originated with her. Yes, I set the pages down. My hands were trembling, not the shallow tremor of cold or exhaustion, but the deep bone-level shaking of a person whose body is working to absorb something the mind has not yet fully accepted. She sat across my dinner table, I said. At Christmas 2 years ago, she brought a pie. My throat tightened painfully around the words. I thought she was good for him. I told Caleb I was glad he'd found someone steady. I know, Alden said, and the gentleness in his voice somehow made it worse, made the whole thing more solid, more real, more impossible to hold at any distance. I pressed both hands over my face and breathed slow and deliberate the way you breathe when you're trying to hold the shape of yourself together against a pressure that wants to take it apart. When I lowered my hands, my jaw was set. My eyes dry, and something deep in my chest had gone very still, the way a storm goes still at its center. What do we do now? I asked. I can have everything on that table in front of a Brunswick PD detective within the hour, Alden said. Caleb would be arrested by tonight. Sienna likely within 48 hours, depending on the warrant timeline. He held my gaze. That is one option. What's the other option? Alden looked at me steadily. Caleb works at Wyndham Capital. He has worked there for 6 years, drawing a salary from your family's company, sitting in meetings in a building that bears your father's name, not knowing any of it. He paused. You are the legal owner of that company. You have the right to walk into that building as its rightful head. And if you choose to do that before the police are called in front of every executive, every employee, every person who has watched Caleb Marsh build his career on ground that was never his, then Caleb doesn't just face criminal charges. Alden's voice was measured, but his eyes were sharp. He faces the complete and public collapse of everything he thought he had, with nowhere to hide and no story left to tell. The image formed fully in my mind, Caleb, in that building, comfortable and unsuspecting, and then the doors opening. From a legal standpoint, Alden continued, presenting the evidence in that setting before credible witnesses, including board members and potentially press, actually strengthens the criminal case. It creates a documented public record of his response. Prosecutors favor that. He held my gaze. It is not justice, Leonard. It is the smarter legal strategy. I lifted the photograph of Edmund Wyndham from the bed beside me, the one Alden Forsythe had shown me hours earlier, the silver-haired man at the mahogany desk, who had spent 63 years keeping a room ready. My father never lived to see this moment, but I was going to make certain Caleb understood exactly what he had discarded. Schedule the board meeting, I said. I want every executive in that room. I set the photograph back down, and Alden not a word to the police until after I've walked through those doors. Alden held my gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded, once reached for his phone, and began to dial. I walked out of Memorial Health University Medical Center on a Tuesday morning wearing the same clothes I'd been admitted in. A nurse named Greta, the same one who had pressed tissues into my hands on the worst morning of my life, had washed and folded them while I was in the ICU. She left them on the chair beside my bed without making any kind of thing of it. I never got the chance to thank her properly. She was already halfway down the hall with someone who needed her more. The morning air met my face the instant the automatic doors slid apart, and I paused on the concrete apron just outside the entrance just for a moment, just to feel it. March in Brunswick. Not cold, not warm. That particular in-between temperature the low country does better than anywhere else. The air carried a faint salt edge off the harbor, threaded with something green and alive. I drew it in slowly, deliberately, the way you breathe, when you've just been reminded that breathing is not something to take for granted. Alden was waiting beside a black sedan at the curb. He opened the rear door without ceremony. "How are you feeling?" he asked, like a man who spent 10 days in a coma and then spent the next 18 hours having his entire life explained to him. "Various things," I said. Alden almost smiled. "That's fair," he said. I got in. The leather seat was warmer than the outside air, the interior carrying the scent of cedar and something clean. Alden settled into the front passenger seat, and a driver, I hadn't met a quiet man in his 50s named Walter, introduced briefly by Alden as the estate's head of household transport, pulled smoothly into traffic. We drove south through Garden City first, my neighborhood. I watched it slide past through the glass, the warehouse district where I'd put in 30 years of my life, the dollar store on Habersham Street where I'd bought Caleb's school supplies every August, the diner on Rivers Avenue where I'd eaten Saturday breakfast alone for the last 5 years, ever since Caleb stopped showing up. Ordinary, weathered, known. The landscape of a life I had built without knowing it wasn't mine. "You're going to feel like a stranger there at first," Alden said, watching me watch the window. "At the manor. That's normal. Give it time." "How long did it take you," I asked, "to feel at home there yourself?" Alden considered the question with the weight it deserved. "About 2 years," he said, and I wasn't carrying 63 years of somewhere else. The scenery shifted as we crossed onto the peninsula. Streets narrowed and quieted. The buildings grew older, more deliberate. The trees bigger. Live oaks hung with Spanish moss that swayed in the March breeze like slow, unhurried breathing. Historic District Brunswick, a part of the city I'd driven through 100 times, without stopping, always carrying some vague, unexamined sense that it wasn't meant for me. Walter turned onto a private lane I had never noticed before, easy to overlook, set between 2 high garden walls. No signage. He slowed as we approached a pair of tall iron gates, black ornate the metalwork, forming a repeating pattern of leaves with what I now recognized as the Wyndham crest at the center of each. A brass plate on the right pillar read simply, "Wyndham House Est, 1887. The gates drew open as we came near. "Electronic," Alden said, noticing my look. "Your father had them automated in the 90s. He said the manual chain was undignified for a man of his age. A beat. He was 58 at the time. The lane beyond the gates was lined on both sides with mature live oaks, their canopies reaching toward each other, overhead to form a natural tunnel of green and gray. Afternoon light fell through in broken shifting patterns across the dark asphalt. At the end of the lane, the house came into view. My breath caught. I'd passed Wyndham Capital Group on Meeting Street often enough to know the family had money. But knowing a family has money and seeing where they actually lived are two entirely different things. The manor rose 3 stories, white-painted brick black shutters flanking every window, a broad front portico held up by 4 fluted columns that had been standing longer than my grandparents had been alive. The proportions were everything the word historic implied. Not ostentatious, not performing wealth, simply built by people who intended the thing to outlast them by several generations, and had engineered it to do exactly that. A formal garden spread across the front, centered on a circular drive, and a marble fountain running in the late morning light, the water catching it in small, bright fragments. Walter brought the car to a stop at the base of the front steps. When I stepped out, I found 8 people arranged in 2 lines flanking the entrance, 4 on each side, dressed in neat, dark uniforms, standing with the quiet, composed attention of people who took their work seriously. A woman at the front of the left line, the oldest among them, silver hair drawn back with the bearing of someone who had run a large household for decades, stepped forward. "Welcome home, Mr. Wyndham," she said. Her name, Alden told me quietly, was Mrs. Winifred Crane, head of household for 22 years. "We've been waiting a long time for this day." My throat closed without warning, and I had to swallow hard twice before I could answer. "Thank you," I managed. "I appreciate that more than you know." Alden guided me up the stone steps and through the front door, wide, dark-stained wood, the brass hardware polished to a mirror, finish into the entrance hall. The first thing I noticed was the floor black and white marble in a geometric pattern, worn smooth at the center, where decades of footsteps had passed. The second was the ceiling-high plasterwork cornice running the perimeter, a chandelier hanging at the center, switched off at this hour, its crystal drops catching the daylight from the flanking windows and scattering it in small, restless points across the walls. The third thing was the photographs. They lined both walls of the entrance hall in dark wooden frames, arranged chronologically from the front door to the back, a visual history of the Wyndham family spanning more than a century. Formal portraits, candid shots, group photographs at what appeared to be company milestones. Edmund as a young man, sharp-eyed and already authoritative. Edmund beside a woman I understood without needing to ask. Was my mother Elspeth laughing at something outside the frame? Her head tilted back, looking more alive in that frozen instant than most people managed in motion. I moved slowly along the wall, hands at my sides, not touching anything. And then I found it near the center of the right-hand wall, at eye level, in a frame slightly larger than the ones surrounding it. A photograph of a little boy, 4 or 5 years old, standing in the morning light of a garden I now recognized as the one just outside. He was squinting into the sun, he was grinning, on his right wrist catching the light, the bracelet, my bracelet. I reached up and pressed my fingertips to the glass very lightly, and the contact, cool, hard, real, sent something moving through me that I couldn't have named if I'd tried. "He put it there himself," Alden said from behind me. "Center of the wall, eye level. He said it was so he'd see it every morning when he came downstairs. His voice was careful, steady, carrying something immense inside it. He saw it every morning for 63 years. Leonard." My eyes burned hot and fierce, and I blinked hard against it. "Take me upstairs," I said. My voice came out rougher than I meant it to. "I want to see the rest of it." Alden nodded. He led me to the staircase, broad curving the banister, worn smooth where hands had rested on it for 130 years. At the top, a long hallway stretched in both directions. He turned right toward the far end, where the corridor finished at a single door. A bough of fresh magnolia had been laid across the threshold. White flowers just opened. Alden stopped in front of the door and turned to face me. "Are you ready?" he asked. My heart was knocking so hard I could feel it in my throat. I pressed my hand flat against my chest for a moment, steady and grounding, and then I nodded. "Open it," I said. The hinges didn't creak. I noticed that immediately. The door swung open on perfectly maintained hardware, smooth and silent. The kind of upkeep that doesn't happen by chance. Those hinges had been oiled on a regular schedule. Somebody had tended to this door with intention for years. The smell reached me before my vision had fully settled into the room. Aged wood and dried paper. The particular quiet of a space that has been preserved rather than simply maintained. And beneath all of it, fresh flowers, the magnolia from the entryway. Yes, but also something else, something that had lived in this room long enough to become woven into it. Then the room sharpened into focus. It was smaller than I'd pictured. Not a grand nursery, just a boy's bedroom, the kind that belongs to a child who played hard and read widely, and hadn't yet grown past the need to keep everything within arm's reach. A single bed along the left wall, made up neatly with a green coverlet that had faded slightly along the edges from decades of light exposure. A wooden bookshelf running floor to ceiling on the right, crowded with children's books. Their spines sun-softened and cracked, worn titles I couldn't make out from the doorway, but somehow knew had been favorites. A small desk sat beneath the window, its surface bare except for a pencil cup, a spelling primer, and placed at the exact center of the desk, a single white magnolia blossom in a small glass of water, fully open, completely fresh. Above the desk, taped to the wall, with yellowed tape that had been carefully reapplied along the edges to keep it from peeling away, a crayon drawing on white paper. Two figures, one tall, one small, standing side by side before a house with 4 windows and a sun in the corner. Beneath them, in the large uneven lettering of a child who had only recently learned to write "Me and Daddy." My knees buckled so suddenly I had to brace one hand against the doorframe to keep from going down. "Come in," Alden said, his voice soft. "It's yours." I crossed the threshold slowly, the way a man moves when he's entering somewhere sacred, and I suppose that's exactly what it was. My shoes made no sound on the wooden floor. I walked to the desk and stood before it, before the drawing, before those 2 crayon figures, the tall one and the small one. And I understood in a way that skipped past thought entirely and landed somewhere deeper and older and more essential, that the small figure was me. I had drawn this. These were my hands that had pressed those crayons to that paper. My voice that had said to someone, to Edmund, to my father, "Daddy, look what I made." And he had kept it for 63 years. Through everything he had kept it on this wall. "It's the flowers," I said. The words came out barely above a whisper. "You placed one every week, every Monday morning," Alden said. He stood just inside the doorway, hands folded, voice very careful. "Your father's instructions were to keep the room ready to maintain it as though you might walk through the door on any given day." A pause. I took ready to mean alive. A room with fresh flowers in it is alive. A room without them is a museum. I turned to face him, eyes burning so fiercely I couldn't pretend otherwise. "How many times," I asked, "how many Mondays did you walk into this room?" 3,276, Alden said. "Mondays give or take a handful of weeks when illness or travel got in the way, which I made up for the following week." He held my gaze with the steadiness of a man who had long since come to terms with what he was saying. I never missed a month. The sob that moved through me rose from somewhere I hadn't known, existed below. Grief below loss, below even the anger of that morning and the revelations of that afternoon. It came from the place where a child goes on, living inside every grown person. The place that had spent 63 years not knowing it had a father who lit a candle and kept a room ready and pinned a drawing to the wall and never, not once, stopped believing. I pressed both palms over my face and let it move through me. I couldn't have held it back if I'd tried, and I didn't want to. Alden gave me the full space of it, without flinching, without moving, without filling the silence with anything that would have made it feel smaller. When I finally lowered my hands, my face was wet, and my chest ached with something that was not entirely pain. I pulled the desk chair out and sat down the chair that had once been mine at the desk, where I had once practiced letters and drawn pictures of my father and myself, and I looked at Alden. "Sit down," I said. "Please." He crossed the room and settled on the edge of the bed I had slept in before everything fell apart, and watched me with the patient attention of a man who understood that whatever I was about to say mattered. "You said last night that Caleb's actions were planned," I said. "Not panic, not desperation, planned." I held his gaze. "I need you to tell me everything now. Not the financial records, not the insurance. I need to know what Caleb knew about who I am, about this family, about this house." My voice hardened at the edges because a man who panics abandons his father in a hospital. A man who plans something that buys an insurance policy first. I leaned forward. "So, tell me, when did he know?" Alden's expression shifted. The gentleness of the past few minutes receded, replaced by something more measured, more deliberate. "That he said is the part of this story that changes everything about how you understand what he did." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a single folded sheet. A timeline I realized printed and annotated in Alden's neat hand. Caleb Marsh discovered your real identity. Alden said in January of 2022, 2 years and 3 months ago. He placed the sheet on the desk in front of me, and from that day forward, every decision he made was driven by a single question. He looked at me steadily. How do I make sure my father never finds out? The room felt as though it had contracted around me, the ceiling lower, the walls closer. The faded crayon drawing on the wall, suddenly the sharpest thing in my entire field of vision. He knew, I said. The words fell like stones into still water. He knew who I was. He sat at my table and called me on my birthday and came to my apartment for Thanksgiving. And he knew. Yes, Alden said. He knew. The anger that rose in me then was different from everything that had come before, colder, quieter, and far more complete. Tell me how, I said. Tell me exactly how he found out. Alden unfolded the sheet. It started, he said, with your bracelet. The morning after I first stepped into that untouched childhood bedroom, I did not sleep. I sat in the leather armchair by the window and watched the live oak trees outside move in the March wind, their Spanish moss trailing like silver curtains through the dark. My chest would not stop hurting, not from the fall, not from the coma, but from the sheer weight of everything Alden had told me in that room. When dawn came, Alden was already waiting at the long mahogany table in the study, 2 cups of coffee steaming between a stack of manila folders and a single yellow legal pad filled with tight, precise handwriting. He slid 1 cup toward me the moment I sat down. You didn't rest? He said. Not a question. How could I? My voice came out rougher than I meant it to, scraped raw. You told me my son knew who I really was. You told me he'd known for more than 2 years and said nothing. I need to understand every step of what he did. Alden set down his coffee, folded his hands on the table, and held my gaze with those steady gray eyes. Then, let me walk you through it. All of it from the beginning. He opened the first folder and slid it across to me. Inside was a photograph, a printout slightly grainy taken from what appeared to be security camera footage. The image showed Caleb younger looking than I had seen him recently, standing inside what appeared to be a storage unit. He was holding something small up toward the light. My stomach dropped. I leaned in closer. Is that your bracelet? Alden confirmed, his voice measured and even, or rather a photograph of it. He captured that image on January 14th, 2022, 2 years and 3 months ago. I pressed my fist to my sternum, as if I could physically keep my heart from cracking apart. How did he even find it? You had it in a tin box, Alden said carefully, in the back of the closet at your Garden City Savannah house. Caleb was helping you sort through some things after you'd had a mild dizzy spell. Do you remember? You asked him to bring down some old papers. I did remember. I shut my eyes for a moment, and the memory rose with horrible sharpness. Me on the couch head, still foggy, telling Caleb which box to pull down. It hadn't crossed my mind to think twice. He was my son. I trusted him with my home, my things, my whole modest life. He found the tin, I said, my voice drained of everything. He found the tin. Alden repeated, and inside it was the bracelet and the single photograph of you as a child that Vera had apparently kept and left with you at the orphanage. He recognized the Wyndham family crest engraved on the bracelet. Right away, he had seen it before. My head snapped up. He'd seen it before. Alden's expression hardened just barely. Caleb had been working at Wyndham Capital Group for 4 years. By then, a position Sienna had specifically pushed him toward, 2 years into their relationship, after she had looked into the firm's ownership structure and noticed the unresolved estate. He was Senior Vice President of Portfolio Management. The Wyndham family crest appears on the company letterhead, on the lobby wall, on every official document he had handled across those 4 years. Alden tapped the folder. He knew precisely what that crest meant. My hands were shaking. I pressed them flat against the table to still them, but the trembling ran all the way up my arms. So, he looked at that bracelet and he knew. He knew the crest. He did not yet understand what it meant in relation to you. Alden paused, letting the exactness of that distinction settle. So, he did what a calculating man does. He researched quietly, carefully over several weeks. He cross-referenced the orphanage records, what little public records survived before the 1977 fire, with Wyndham Capital's historical filings. He found a reference to Edmund Wyndham's missing son, the open estate, the standing search. And then he understood. My throat constricted until the words barely came. He understood that his own father, the man he called a burden, was the heir to nearly $1 billion. Yes. Alden's voice was quiet, but iron underneath. And instead of coming to you, instead of picking up the phone and saying, "Dad, I think there's something you need to hear," he went home that night and told his wife. The air went out of me. My eyes burned hot and fierce, and I pressed my knuckles hard against my lips to hold back something that was neither quite a sob nor quite a scream. "Sienna," I managed. "Sienna." Alden drew out a second document, printed text messages, page after page, time-stamped and highlighted in yellow. These were recovered from Caleb's personal device by the forensic investigator I brought on in February 2024. The first message is dated January 21st, 2022, 1 week after Caleb photographed the bracelet. He pointed to a highlighted line. "I made myself read it. Caleb found something. The old man might be worth more than we thought. A lot more. Sienna define a lot more. Caleb try, 950 million. Sienna, are you serious right now?" Caleb dead serious, but only if he claims it. We need to make sure he never does. The room tilted. I gripped the edge of the table knuckles, going white breath, coming in short, ragged pulls. My own son? 8 words. We need to make sure he never does. 8 words that set everything into motion. The stolen savings, the forged POA, the sold house, the loosened bolts on a stair railing, and a man lying in a coma for 10 days wondering why no one came. My eyes filled. I didn't try to stop it this time. One tear, then another, sliding hot down my face while I stared at those words on the page. "He chose the money," I said, and my voice broke on the last word. "He chose it over me." Alden reached across the table and covered my hand with his. His grip was firm and steady, the way you hold someone standing at the edge of something they cannot come back from. "Mr. Wyndham," he said, and the name still sent a jolt through my chest every single time. "What your son chose, that is on him. What comes next? That is entirely up to you." He reached into the bottom of the folder and set a cream-colored envelope on the table between us. The paper had aged to the color of old honey, and across the front in handwriting I had never seen before were 3 words. "For my Leonard. This belonged to your father," Alden said. "Edmund wrote it in the last week of his life. He asked me to give it to you when you were ready to fight." I stared at that envelope a long time before I touched it. My fingertips hovered over the aged paper, as if the warmth of my father's handwriting might still linger there, some residual heat from the hand that had pressed pen to page, knowing he would never see my face again. Finally, Alden spoke. "You don't have to open it right now," he said, his voice low and unhurried. "But I need you to understand something before we go any further. If you want to reclaim what is yours legally, publicly, and permanently, we need to act within the next 3 weeks." I set the envelope gently to one side, pressing my palm flat against it for just a moment. Then I straightened in my chair, wiped my face with the back of my hand, and forced myself to focus. "Tell me everything." Alden pulled the yellow legal pad to the center of the table, and for the next several seconds the only sound in the room was the scratch of his pen underlining what he had already written. Then he looked up. "The DNA results came back 48 hours ago from the private laboratory in Macon," he began. "Full genomic match. You are Edmund Wyndham's biological son. That result is notarized, certified, and admissible in any Georgia court." He slid a sealed document toward me, bearing a red official stamp. "That is your identity restored in the eyes of the law." I lifted it with both hands. They were still trembling slightly, I could feel it, but I held the document steady by sheer will, and the estate. The will was filed with Chatham County Probate Court in March 2021, 8 months before Edmund passed. Alden said it names, quote, "my biological son, Leonard Edmund Wyndham, as sole heir to all personal assets, real property, and controlling interest in Wyndham Capital Group. The DNA confirmation triggers immediate activation of the estate transfer." He paused, letting that weight settle fully before he continued. "In plain terms, as of 48 hours ago, you are the legal owner of Wyndham Capital Group Wyndham House, and an estate currently valued at $950 million. The number hit me in the chest like a physical blow every time I heard it. I exhaled slowly through my teeth. "And Caleb." Alden's jaw set. "Caleb Marsh holds his senior vice president position under a standard employment contract containing a fraud clause and a morality clause. The moment we present evidence of criminal conduct to the board, that contract is void, and he can be removed immediately. No severance, no appeal period." He tapped the stack of folders. We have that evidence. The question is how we present it. I leaned forward. Walk me through it. For the next hour, Alden laid out the architecture of a plan he had clearly been building for weeks. He spread documents across the table like a general arranging a battlefield. The bank statements showing the $52,000 withdrawal, the real estate deed in Sienna's name, the forensic handwriting analysis of the forged power of attorney, the USB drive with the security footage of Caleb on that staircase, and the insurance policy with the fraudulent signature, flagged at 94% certainty. We do not go to the police first, Alden explained, his tone firm. If we go to the police first, Caleb's attorney files for a stay, freezes the estate proceedings, and we could be tied up in probate court for 12 to 18 months, while Caleb continues drawing his salary from your company. His finger landed on the legal pad where he had written 2 words in capital letters: board meeting. We go to the board first. You walk into Wyndham Capital as Leonard Wyndham, heir and legal owner of controlling interest. You present the DNA confirmation, the will, and the evidence of fraud in that order in front of every board member and senior executive simultaneously. Caleb will be in that room. He attends every Thursday board meeting. My pulse surged. This Thursday, Alden confirmed. He looked at me steadily. That gives us 3 days to prepare. After the board meeting, the Brunswick PD White-Collar Crimes Unit will be waiting in the lobby with warrants already in hand. We coordinate the timing so that Caleb cannot leave the building. I pushed back from the table and stood needing to move, needing to feel my legs under me. What I'm about to share is the moment I understood exactly what my own son had been doing, not just behind my back, but while sitting at my table pouring my coffee, asking about my knee. Before I get there, let me ask you something. If you slowly realized someone you loved had been working against you all along, would you confront them face to face, or would you gather every piece of proof first and say nothing? I moved to the window and laid one hand against the cold pane. Beyond the glass, the grounds of Wyndham House opened up wide and lush in the early light. The iron fence running its long perimeter, the avenue of oaks, the ancient magnolia, whose lowest branch had grown so heavy it nearly grazed the lawn. 3 months ago, he was seated at my table for Christmas dinner, I said. My voice came out rougher than I intended. He poured my coffee. He asked about my knee. My throat seized. The whole time he was sitting there, he was all ready. Yes, Alden said. The warmth had left his voice entirely. What remained was something clean and unyielding. He was, and that is precisely what makes Thursday so important. Not for you alone, Leonard, for everyone that Caleb and Sienna were going to leave with nothing. I turned from the window. My teeth were clenched. There was a fire in my chest that had no name, but beneath that something steadier had taken root, a foundation that simply wasn't there 72 hours ago. When I met Alden's eyes, something settled inside me that had been unsettled for 68 years. I knew for the first time that I was standing in the right place. 3 days, I said. 3 days. Alden pushed back his chair, came around the table, and offered his hand. There was something living in his gaze, something I would only later recognize as a 30-year promise arriving at its destination. Welcome back, Mr. Wyndham. I gripped his hand, steady, dry-eyed. Beyond the glass, the Georgia sun kept climbing over the live oaks unhurried, and Gold completely unaware that a storm was 3 days out. Those 3 days moved the way a held breath does, compressed, unbearable, unable to last. On the morning of Thursday, March 27th, a charcoal suit was waiting for me, hung on the back of the bedroom door. Alden had placed it there before I woke at 5:30. I stood before it for nearly a full minute without reaching out. Fine wool the shade of an incoming storm, and there on the breast pocket stitched in silver thread, fine enough that you had to look twice, the Wyndham family crest. I pressed 2 fingers to it. It was your father's, Alden said. He was standing in the doorway. In the final year of his life, Edmund had it tailored to a grown man's measurements, the size of a son he always believed would one day come back. He never got to give it away. My throat shut completely. I took the cup from Alden's hand, forced it down, and faced the suit again. Then I won't let it go to waste, I said. Wyndham House to downtown Brunswick is 22 minutes by car. Walter kept his eyes on the road and his hands quiet on the wheel while Alden worked through a folder of papers beside me, and I watched Brunswick stir to life beyond the window. The morning had that pale, luminous quality a March day can carry, wrought iron railings, flower boxes, the harbor catching the light somewhere in the distance. I had moved through this city 10,000 times, as Henry Marsh bad knees, a modest savings account, a son I would have burned the world down for. This was different. This time I was Leonard Wyndham. "Tell me about Vivian Caswell," I said into the quiet. Alden set down his papers. 71 years old, 19 years on the Wyndham Capital Board. "Your father appointed her in 2005. Of all the board members, she was the only one Edmund brought into his confidence about you, not every detail, but the shape of it." He paused. "She is aware a search has been underway. She understands what a confirmed DNA result means. She won't be caught off guard. The full group is 7 board members, 3 senior executives, Caleb among them." Alden's voice didn't waver, but a muscle in his jaw did. "Not one of them has any idea what this morning actually is. As far as everyone in that building is concerned, they're walking into a routine quarterly review." He tucked the folder closed. "Caleb filed his agenda items yesterday afternoon, sent them from his desk at 4:47. I looked at Alden. "He genuinely doesn't know." "Not a thing," Alden said. For just a beat, something moved behind those gray eyes. Not quite a smile, but close. Not a single thing. Wyndham Capital Group held the top 4 floors of a restored Beaux-Arts building on Broad Street 2 blocks back from the waterfront. The lobby was all high ceilings and pale marble, the family crest rendered in a black and gold mosaic underfoot, large enough that arriving visitors had to make a choice skirt around it, or step directly across. I stepped across. A young woman in a navy blazer sat at the security desk. She glanced up as we came through the doors, began the standard greeting. Then her gaze snagged on my breast pocket on the embroidered crest, and the greeting died in her mouth. She straightened without a word. "Good morning, sir." The register of her voice had shifted entirely. Alden moved to the desk before I could speak. "Alden Forsyth, Chief Counsel and Executive of the Edmund Wyndham Estate. We're expected at 9:00, Ms. Caswell." He placed his card on the counter unprompted. The elevator to the 41st floor was fast. My heart was not. But it wasn't fear driving it. I had made my peace with fear, somewhere in the small hours lying still in Edmund's house, with that cream-colored envelope pressed against my sternum. What was moving through me now ran deeper and older than fear. A reckoning, maybe? The weight of 68 years lived beneath a borrowed name building behind me like a tide, and me finally pivoting to meet it head-on. Vivian Caswell intercepted us in the hallway just outside the boardroom doors. Tall, silver-haired eyes like a hawk's, dressed in charcoal with a rope of pearls at her collar. She carried herself with the unhurried authority of a woman who had kept rooms in order for 20 years. When she saw me, she went still. Her gaze traveled from my face to the crest on my pocket and back again, and her chin rose just slightly, the reflex of someone pressing down hard on their own composure. "Mr. Wyndham," she said. Steady voice, except for the very last syllable, where something fractured almost imperceptibly. "Miss Caswell." I put out my hand. She took it in both of hers and held on a beat past what custom required. "Edmund spoke of you," she said, keeping her voice low. "He spoke of you for years. He never let go of the belief that you'd come." She released my hand, drew her lips together, and reeled herself back into the formality the moment demanded. "The room is prepared. Everyone has taken their seat." A glance at Alden. "Everything is cued in the presentation system per your instructions." "Thank you, Vivian," Alden said. One nod and she turned and pushed through the heavy mahogany door. The boardroom was long and paneled in dark wood, one entire side of it given over to floor-to-ceiling windows with the harbor spread out below. Morning sun poured in from the east and lay across the conference table, a broad run of polished walnut leather chairs filled on both sides. Board members with their suit jackets on, executives with laptops, open a junior staffer in the corner, keeping notes. And at the far end, occupying the chair that commanded the door, a man in a charcoal jacket with a burgundy pocket square, folded into a perfect point, tilted back in his seat with the unhurried ease of someone who considered the room his personal property. Caleb. His attention was on his phone when the door swung open. He looked up, that half-present glance people give when they're expecting no one in particular, and then he registered me. The phone slipped 2 inches in his grip. I watched the blood leave his face as though someone had opened a drain. His lips separated. His stare jumped to Alden, came back to me, dropped to the crest on my pocket. I could see the moment understanding broke through, not simply that his father was standing there, but what his father's presence in that room, wearing that suit on that particular morning meant. His fingers locked around the table's edge. "Dad." A word that barely made it out hollow and airless, the sound a man makes when he discovers the floor he's been standing on was never solid. I walked the length of the room to the head of the table, the end opposite Caleb, and I placed both palms flat on the walnut surface and took my time looking at every person seated there until I had seen them all. Then I spoke. My name, I said, and my voice held without a tremor, is Leonard Edmund Wyndham, and I am home. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. I know because I measured it against my own pulse. Then the room broke open all at once, 2 board members talking over each other, an executive coming halfway out of his chair. Vivian Caswell crossed wordlessly to the presentation panel, pressed one button, and the screen behind me blazed to life with the first document. The DNA certification red-stamped and notarized from the private laboratory in Macon. Alden was already in motion. He set his briefcase on the table, unlatched it with 2 crisp clicks, and began laying document packets at every seat, thick-tabbed, color-coded. His movements were unhurried, almost ceremonial, the way a man moves when he has rehearsed something 10,000 times, and the moment has at last arrived. I kept my eyes fixed on Caleb. Caleb hadn't moved from his chair. His hand was still braced against the table's edge, knuckles drained of colored jaw, working like a man trying to assemble a sentence, and losing the thread each time. His burgundy pocket square, I noticed it now, with a strange, painful precision, was folded into a perfect point, the kind of careful detail a man tends to when he needs the world to believe he has everything under control. "Dad," he said again louder this time, forcing the word into the room like a stake in the ground. "What is going on? What is this?" He swept his gaze around the table, pitching his voice toward the other board members, performing bewilderment. "I don't understand what—" "Caleb." Alden's voice was quiet and absolute, the way a closing door is quiet. "I'll ask you to hold your remarks until the presentation is finished. You'll have your opportunity to respond. That time is not now." Caleb's mouth snapped shut. His chest was heaving. Alden pressed a button on the remote, and the DNA document gave way to the next slide. A scan of Edmund Wyndham's will, the critical clause enlarged and highlighted in yellow. My biological son, Leonard. Edmund Wyndham's sole heir to all personal assets, real property, and controlling interest in Wyndham Capital Group. A board member near the center of the table, a heavy-set man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, leaned in and read the slide carefully. Then he looked at me, then at Alden. "This is notarized and probate filed. Chatham County Probate Court, March 2021. Alden confirmed DNA confirmation received Tuesday, March 25th. The estate transfer is legally active as of that date." He addressed the room steadily. "Every person in this building has spent the past 2 years working for Leonard Wyndham without knowing it." The heavy-set board member removed his reading glasses entirely and set them on the table with a soft click. "Good Lord, this is insane." Caleb shoved back from his chair and stood. His voice had climbed an octave edge with something reaching for outrage but trembling too hard to hold its shape. "You walk in here with some document and a DNA test, and you think that you can just—" He pointed at me, his finger unsteady. "He's my father, Henry Marsh. He worked in a warehouse for 40 years. He doesn't know anything about—" "The third document, please." I said it to Alden. My voice was level. My hands at my sides were balled into fists. The screen changed. Caleb's bank records appeared. 7 withdrawals from my savings account, totaling 47 full orders, 218 all orders each one, dated during the 10 days I lay in a coma at Memorial Health University Medical Center. The room went very still. A woman near the window, one of the senior executives, made a sound that was not quite a word. "Those withdrawals were made using your father's debit card and PIN," Alden said to the room, though his eyes stayed on Caleb. "The PIN was obtained without authorization, under Georgia law that constitutes felony financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult." Caleb's face had shifted from white to a blotched, ugly red. "I was covering expenses while he was—" "At the 4th document," I said. The real estate deed appeared. Caleb Marsh and Sienna Marsh, 412 Skidaway Road, Garden City. Purchase price, $155,000, dated during my hospitalization. Financed using a power of attorney bearing my signature. Alden advanced the slide. Forensic handwriting analysis. 94% certainty of forgery. The signature did not match any verified sample of Mr. Wyndham's handwriting across a 20-year document history. Caleb's hand came up and covered his mouth. He was breathing hard through his nose, his eyes moving rapidly around the table like a man measuring which exits were still open, finding none. Caleb. I spoke his name, and something in my chest tore open when I said it, not with anger, with a grief so enormous I could barely hold it inside my body. My eyes burned. My voice was steady only because I willed it to be. Look at me. He looked at me. His eyes were glassy, the muscles around them tight with something that wasn't quite remorse yet, but was close. The look of a man watching the story he'd told himself about himself come apart in real time. The fifth document, Alden said quietly. The screen changed one final time, and every person in that room went absolutely rigid. It was the security footage, a still frame from the staircase at the Habersham Street apartment building, time-stamped 3 days before my fall. Caleb in a gray t-shirt, crouched at the base of the stair railing with a wrench in his hand. Then Alden advanced to the text message transcript, 2 lines highlighted in the yellow, projected large enough for everyone in the room to read without leaning in. Caleb the old man might be worth more than we thought. Try 950 million. Sienna, we need to make sure he never does. Someone at the table sucked in a sharp breath. Another board member eased back slightly as if putting distance between himself and the words on the screen. Caleb's legs gave. Not completely. He caught himself on the back of his chair, gripping it with both hands, his whole body shaking a visible, undeniable trembling that moved from his hands up through his shoulders. His mouth was open. No sound was coming out. Olin railing, I said, and my voice broke on the word. I could not stop. I did not try. Sent me into a 10-day coma. I woke up alone in a hospital room with a note on the bedside table telling me I was a burden. My eyes were burning so fiercely I could barely see him. You wrote that note, Caleb. You sold my house. You took my savings and you stood in that stairwell with a wrench and you made a choice. A tear ran down my face. I didn't wipe it away. The Brunswick Police Department's White-Collar Crimes Unit and Violent Crimes Division are currently in the lobby of this building, Alden said. He looked at Caleb with an expression that held no cruelty and no triumph, only the exhausted, unshakable finality of a man who had been working toward a single moment for 30 years. They have warrants for your arrest: felony financial exploitation, forgery, property fraud, and 1 count of reckless endangerment causing grievous bodily harm. A simultaneous warrant is being executed at your home address for Sienna Marsh. The door at the far end of the boardroom opened. 2 officers in plain clothes entered, badges visible, and the sound of their footsteps on the hardwood floor was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Caleb looked at me one last time. His face had crumpled entirely. The careful pocket square, the practiced confidence, all of it dissolved, and what was left underneath was something I had not seen on my son's face since he was very young. It looked almost like a child who knew he had done something that could not be taken back. Dad! His voice shattered on the word. I know, I said, and I meant it. All of it, the grief, the love that had not died, even now the absolute heartbroken certainty that what was happening was right. The officers reached him. The door closed behind them, and Caleb, and for 3 full seconds, nobody in that boardroom made a sound. Not because they had nothing to say, but because the weight of what had just happened was still settling over the room the way dust settles after a building comes down. Then Vivian Caswell cleared her throat, and every head turned toward her. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, and her voice was granite steady, the voice of a woman who had chaired difficult meetings for 19 years and intended to see this one through to its end. We have just witnessed the presentation of DNA-verified identity documentation, a probate-filed will and material evidence of multiple felonies committed by a sitting officer of this company. She looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. I move that we formally recognize Leonard Edmund Wyndham as the legal owner of controlling interest in Wyndham Capital Group, effective immediately pending completion of estate transfer filings already in progress with the Chatham County Probate Court. The heavy-set board member, I would later learn his name was Hank Pelton, 22 years on the board, raised his hand without hesitation. Seconded. Alden leaned toward me and said quietly, "You need to vote yes." "Yes," I said. The word came out barely above a whisper, and my voice cracked on it just slightly because it was the first time in my life I had voted on anything that was mine. The motion passed 7-0. Vivienne lifted a pen, added her signature to the top copy of the resolution document Alden had drawn up, and nudged it across the table toward me. The pen was solid silver engraved, and when my fingers closed around it, my hand was shaking so badly that Alden quietly covered it with his own, just long enough to steady me. I signed. Leonard Edmund Wyndham. Those 3 words sat on the page like something I had always known was mine, but had never been allowed to touch enormous and right, and almost too much to hold. "Congratulations, Mr. Wyndham," Vivian said. Every syllable was measured controlled, but her eyes were shining with something she could not quite contain. "Welcome to your company." I clamped my lips shut and managed a nod, because speech was not available to me just then. Alden's phone vibrated against the table. He checked it and raised his eyes to mine. Sienna Marsh was taken into custody at 9:47 this morning at the residence on Skidaway Road. No resistance. He placed the phone face down. "It's done." The breath I released then had been stored somewhere deep in my ribcage for what felt like 3 weeks or 68 years. It was hard to know which measure was more accurate. My whole frame sagged. My chest ached with something that was not precisely pain, yet occupied the same address. The particular ache of a long-held tension finally giving way. Hank Pelton's voice came from the far side of the table, rough edged but without cruelty. "Mr. Wyndham, this board owes you an apology. Not one of us had any idea what Caleb Marsh was doing. Not one." He paused, flattened his mouth, then pushed on. "Edmund was a decent man. He should not have had to end this way. And neither should you." The pressure behind my eyes was fierce. "Thank you, Hank," I said. I meant every syllable of it. Vivian got to her feet and crossed to the windows. "Come with me," she said, steering toward the far end of the room, where a glass door gave onto a slim terrace above Broad Street, the harbor visible just beyond. "Your father had a ritual after every board meeting." I went with her. The March air outside was cool and carried salt tinged with the green, brackish smell drifting up from the harbor 2 blocks down. The city lay open beneath us, rooftops, steeples, and the pale ribbon of the waterfront glittering in the mid-morning light. "He would plant himself right here," Vivian said, taking her place at the railing, "and spend exactly 5 minutes looking at the city. He said it kept him honest about why the work mattered." She turned her gaze on me sidelong. "He used to say, 'A man who forgets what he is building toward is just a man who is busy.'" Something locked in my throat. I wrapped both hands around the railing and stared out at everything below. My city, my father's city, the streets I had moved through 10,000 times without ever suspecting they bore my name. Something shifted inside me, then deep and irrevocable, and I understood with total clarity that Henry Marsh was finished, not wiped away, not unmade, but done. I was Leonard Wyndham. I was on the building my father raised wearing the suit he had commissioned for me, the sun warm across my face and 63 years of absence pressing from behind, and I had not fallen. When I stepped back inside, Alden stood near the door, briefcase latched face carrying the subdued look of someone approaching the end of a very long task. His hand went to the inner breast pocket of his jacket and came back with a cream-colored envelope, aged paper, the color of old honey covered in handwriting. I had been careful not to study too closely yet. "Edmund wanted me to put this in your hands somewhere that belonged to you," Alden said. "I'd say this room qualifies." I accepted it with both hands. I held it against my chest for a beat. Could feel the faint resistance of folded sheets inside the physical weight of 63 years' worth of words. "Thank you, Alden," I said. The words came out unguarded, low-warm. For every bit of it, every last year. Something moved across Alden's face, and his eyes went bright. He drew himself up slightly, cleared his throat, and directed his gaze to a point just over my shoulder, toward the skyline beyond the glass. "Your father would have been very proud of you," he said, and I noticed for the only time in all the years I'd known him that his voice did not quite hold. Alden gave me Edmund's study to myself. That was all I had asked for. 30 minutes, afternoon light pooling through those tall windows. The room smelled of aged wood and leather, with something faintly sweet underneath the ghost of 6 decades of weekly magnolia cuttings. I lowered myself into Edmund's chair, my father's chair high-backed and upholstered in deep burgundy, the armrests rubbed down to a shine in the spots where years of thinking had worn through. I placed the cream envelope on the desk and let it sit there. I studied it for a while. Then I broke the seal. What was inside was not one letter. It was dozens folded and stacked, each carrying a date at the top, in the same careful leaning script, each beginning with an identical salutation. "Dear Leonard." The top sheet was dated May 14th, 1962, my 6th birthday. The handwriting looked younger, more pressured strokes, urgency bleeding through the ink deep enough that the reverse side of the page held the impressions of each letter. Dear Leonard, today, you would have turned 6. I went ahead and bought a cake. Lemon cake, because your mother always said you would love lemon. And I kept it on the kitchen table for a full hour, unable to make myself put it away. I don't know where you are. I don't know whether you're sleeping somewhere warm. I don't know if anyone reads to you, or if you cry in the dark and no one answers. Those questions are lodged inside me the way splinters are too deep to dig out. But know this: wherever life has taken you, your father has not stopped searching. I will not stop. My fist went to my mouth. The words swam as my eyes filled, and I had to put the page down, spread both hands flat on the desk, and work at breathing nose and teeth out, because what rose up in me had no name and no ceiling. He wrote one every year, came Alden's voice from the doorway. I hadn't registered his return. I looked over. My face was wet, and I made no move to address it. Every birthday. The question barely cleared my lips. Alden came in and settled into the chair across the desk, the same chair I'd occupied 2 days ago when the architecture of my own history was being handed back to me in stacks of documents. Every May 14th, he said. The final one is dated May 14th, 2021, 8 months before he died. He folded his hands in his lap. 63 letters, 63, one for each year of my absence. I looked at that stack and my chest buckled once hard beyond my control, and then the grief arrived in full. Not the careful, contained variety I'd managed earlier, but something raw and animal, a sound that had not come out of me since childhood, back when I had not yet learned that the world holds this much sorrow and this much love within the same walls. Alden did not try to quiet me. He held his gaze steady. He stayed in that room with me, the way only certain people know how to stay fully present, not crowding, not retreating. When I had air again, I ran the back of my hand across my face and reached into the middle of the pile for another page. May 14th, 1988. I would have been 32. Dear Leonard, I brought on a young attorney today, Alden Forsyth. Keen judgment, steady character. I've mentioned you to him only in outline. He offered to assist with the search. I told him it is a search without an end date. He said he understood that. I think he truly did. I hope you are somewhere good. I hope there is at least one person in your life who can make you laugh. I hope, Lord, I carry so many hopes for you, son. Always have. He told you about me back in 1988, I said, raising my eyes to Alden. Alden's jaw shifted. He did. I was 31, fresh into the chief counsel role. He summoned me in here. He swept a hand at the walls around us. He was sitting right where you are, and he put the photograph of you as a boy on the desk between us. He told me, Alden, there is one obligation in this building that outweighs every other. Do not let me leave this earth before it's resolved. Alden's voice snagged, then steadied. I gave him my word. That was 34 years ago. I set the letter down and covered my face with both hands for a moment. 34 years of Alden's life shaped around a vow to a father who would not accept grief as a conclusion. The full weight of that pressed down on me, like something with mass, something I could sense against my skin. Alden, I dropped my hands and looked at him squarely. Why? You could have walked away at any point after the orphanage records burned after the first 10 years after 20. Why didn't you? Alden turned the question over with the gravity it warranted. Then he said, because Edmund never did. His eyes found mine. And because some promises aren't the kind you can set down. I nodded slowly. My throat was too thick for words. When they came, they were the plainest ones, the only ones that fit. Thank you, I said. Alden, thank you. He nodded once, pressed his lips together, and turned his gaze toward the window. I lifted the final letter from the stack. May 14th, 2021. Edmund's handwriting was labored, now the strokes unsteady, the hand of an old man, a sick man, yet unmistakably the same man who had pressed a heavy pen to paper in 1962 at a kitchen table beside an untouched birthday cake. Dear Leonard, I am 68 years old today. So are you. Can you imagine that? My boy's 68 years old. I don't know what your face looks like now. I don't know whether your hair went gray early the way mine did, or if you kept it dark like your mother's. I don't know if you found happiness. I pray you did. I pray every single day that wherever life carried you, there was some version of happiness waiting inside it. I am leaving everything to you. All of it. Not because of the money. The money is nothing. It is just numbers. But because this company is what I built while I waited for you to come home. I built it so that when you returned, something worthy of the Wyndham name would be standing here to receive you. Come home, Leonard. It is not too late. It was never too late. I love you. I have always loved you. Your father, Edmund. I set the letter down with great care on the desk before me. My hands were trembling so badly that the page shivered as I let it go. Alden, I said, and my voice was wrecked and low and entirely without pretense. I want to do something for the people who never found their way home, for those who woke up in the wrong life and had no Alden, no letter. I looked up at him. I want to establish a foundation, the Second Chance Foundation. Real resources, legal aid housing, family reconnection services, real help. Alden's face moved through several things in quick succession. Surprise, then warmth, then something that bore a striking resemblance to Edmund Wyndham in a memory 34 years old, saying some promises aren't the kind you can set down. Edmund would have loved that, Alden said, and this time he made no effort to hold his voice level. Good. I pressed my palms flat against my father's desk, felt the worn grain of the wood solid beneath me, and looked around the room that had waited 63 years for me to fill it. Then let's begin. 6 months had passed since the morning I walked into Wyndham Capital Group and spoke my own name aloud for the first time. September had come to the city the way it always does, gradually. The heat retreating by degrees, the harbor air shifting from thick and close to something cleaner, cooler, moving through the live oaks like a quiet reminder that the world goes on regardless of what any of us have done or endured. I was at my desk, Edmund's desk, my desk now working through the Second Chance Foundation's first quarterly report, when Alden knocked twice and walked in without waiting, which told me at once that whatever he was carrying was not ordinary business. "You need to see something," he said. He placed 2 items on the desk. The first was a manila folder. The second was a plain white envelope handwritten with a return address I knew immediately: Coastal State Prison in Glenville, Georgia. Caleb's handwriting. I would know it anywhere. My chest tightened like a fist closing around my heart. I rested my fingertips on the envelope, but did not lift it. "What's in the folder first?" I said. Alden opened it. Sienna Marsh filed for divorce on August 3rd. He said, his voice measured and careful. The petition was granted on an uncontested basis 11 days ago. Under the terms of the settlement, she retained the Skidaway Road property the house purchased with your money, along with all joint bank accounts and Caleb's personal investment portfolio. He paused. Caleb's attorney attempted to challenge the asset division from his cell. The court dismissed it. Another pause. "He has nothing, Leonard, not a dollar." The irony was so thorough, so savage, that I didn't know whether to laugh or mourn. The man who had taken everything from me to give to Sienna had been left with nothing by that very same woman. I pressed my knuckles briefly to my lips and stared at the surface of the desk. "She planned that too, didn't she?" "It was never improvised," Alden said quietly. "Her attorney built the prenuptial agreement specifically to favor her position in the event of Caleb's criminal conviction. She anticipated it." He closed the folder. "She is currently living in the Skidaway Roadhouse, the house you paid for." My jaw tightened. But the anger that moved through me was distant, almost impersonal, the feeling you have about a storm that has already passed and cannot be recalled. I picked up Caleb's envelope. The letter inside ran 2 pages handwritten on lined paper, the penmanship uneven in a way his careful boardroom manner never would have permitted. "Dad, I don't expect you to forgive me. I'm not sure I deserve to ask for it, but I need you to know that I am sorry. Not because I got caught, not because she left me with nothing, but because of who I chose to be. You worked 40 years in a warehouse. You never asked me for anything. And I looked at you and saw a problem to manage instead of a father to love. That is the thing I will carry for the rest of my life. I hope the foundation helps people. I hope you are well. I hope I don't know what. I hope except that you are not in pain anymore. Your son, Caleb." I set the letter down. My eyes were burning, not with rage, not with grief exactly, but with something quieter and more final. The love that had not died even in that boardroom. The love that had broken my voice when I said his name to the officers, it was still there. Diminished, reshaped, laced with scar tissue, but still there. "Alden," I said, "I'm going to write him back." Alden's expression shifted: surprise first, then something warmer than surprise. He reached into his jacket pocket and placed a small velvet pouch on the desk between us. "Before you do," he said, "there is one more thing." I opened the velvet pouch with hands that weren't entirely steady. Inside, cradled against the dark fabric, was a silver bracelet, narrow, handcrafted, unmistakably shaped by the same hands that had made the one on my wrist. not identical, a companion piece. Where mine bore the Wyndham crest on its face, this one carried an inscription along its inner band, 6 words engraved so fine, I had to hold it up to the window light to make them out. I looked at Alden. My throat had closed entirely. "Your father had it made in 1960. Alden said, his voice soft and unhurried, the voice of a man delivering the final chapter of a story he had been keeping safe for 30 years. He wore his half every day until the morning he went into hospice. He asked me to hold the other half until I found you." Alden's chin lifted slightly. "I have been carrying it for 2 years and 3 months. I held the new bracelet beside my own, in the window light, one in each hand, and read the inscription on the inner band, slowly, my lips barely moving. A Wyndham is never truly lost. I pressed it to my chest with both hands, my eyes falling shut, my breath long and unsteady. The bracelet on my wrist had been telling me who I was for 67 years without my knowing it. This one, made by a father who had pictured the man his son might become, who had commissioned it and kept it waiting in a velvet pouch for decades, told me something different. It told me he had always believed I was coming home. My shoulders shook. I pressed both hands over my mouth and bent forward over the desk and let it come. Not the sharp, ragged grief of the hospital room or the boardroom, but something else entirely. Something that carried warmth alongside the pain. Something that felt for the first time in a very long time, like arriving. Alden rested his hand on my shoulder and held it there. When my breathing steadied, I clasped the finished bracelet back onto my wrist. The weight of it had changed. Fuller, heavier, the way a sentence transforms when its last word finally lands. "Let's go outside." Alden said, his voice rough at the edges, in a way I had never heard from him before, and which I found I loved. We made our way up to the roof of Wyndham House. The September evening was cooling fast, the sky above Brunswick shifting through amber and rose, and a deep blue that gathered at the horizon, the harbor a band of hammered silver in the distance. Below us, the live oaks swayed in the evening breeze, their Spanish moss drifting slow and silver gray. I stood at the low parapet along the roof's edge, my wrist resting on the stone, the completed bracelet holding the last of the fading light. "Alden," I said, "thank you for every single year of it. That is where I will leave this story today, with both bracelets on my wrist and a name I had to lose for 67 years before I could finally carry it home. I have thought a great deal about what all of this cost. It cost me a son I believed in. It cost me the simple peace of a man who thought he knew who he was. But I believe God does not let a person wander that long, without purpose. Edmund Wyndham spent 63 years writing letters to a boy who never read them, and somehow, across all that distance and silence, the truth still arrived. The Lord's timing is not our timing, but it does not forget. If these father stories have taught me anything worth passing on, it is this. First, do not wait for a perfect moment to tell the people you love what they mean to you. Edmund wrote every year regardless. That discipline of devotion is what kept the door open. Second, when someone's actions stop matching their words, believe the actions. Caleb's words said, "son." His actions said something else entirely. I should have looked closer. Third, a name, a truth, a belonging. These things cannot be permanently buried. They have a way of surfacing. What is yours will find you even when you have stopped looking. Dad's revenge in this story was not rage. It was simply showing up as his full self, walking through those doors, speaking his name, and letting the truth do what deception never could. If this story moved you, I hope you will leave a thought in the comments. And if you know someone who needs to hear something like this today, someone carrying a quiet grief or a question about who they really are, please pass it along. There are more stories here on His Hidden Revenge, and I would be glad to have you stay. Thank you for listening. I will see you in the next one.